I just got in my head that she had to make some videos for my son, who was 5 at the time, or sorry, no, who was 10 at the
10?
time,
Yeah.
and then my husband and his sister, and I thought, "Oh, man, if I"
Yeah.
so I'm just gonna pause and let that sink in. If I could then give them these videos that we could record together after she was gone, think of how good that would feel for them, right?
Yeah.
And I kind of paused on the word "I" because there was a lot of ego involved in this, and I couldn't see it at the time. All I kept thinking was, I have so much information, and
Yeah.
I know what might feel good for people, and so I just have to convince her to do it.
Yeah.
And she initially was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, okay, honey." And then I'd bring it up, and then she'd, "Oh, it's a pretty busy day." And anyway, she kept putting it off. And fortunately, I talked to my brother-in-law about it one day, and he was really blunt with me, and he said, "This is what you want." She never said she really wanted to do that. And so she's showing you how she wants to spend her final time.
Hello, my grieving friend. It's Lisa. Whether you're a longtime listener or you're tuning in for the first time, welcome to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm so glad you're here. By now, you likely know I'm passionate about exploring the nature of grief. As a narrative therapy trained social worker, a grief activist, and a widow, I'm dedicated to helping us learn to be in relationship with our grief instead of running from it. In our modern culture, we've pushed grieving into the shadows, something to be experienced privately, causing us to suffer unnecessarily and in isolation. Grief is our human inheritance. It offers us medicine if we tend to it as a community. So, together with my extraordinary guests, and this season answering your questions too, we're changing the narratives of grief, one conversation at a time. My guest today is someone who, like me, loves talking about the sacred thresholds of life: dying, dementia, death, grief. Lisa Pahl is a licensed clinical social worker and certified advanced practice hospice and palliative social worker with over 18 years in hospice and 7 in emergency medicine. She's passionate about increasing death literacy and helping people face illness, dying, and grief with courage and clarity. Whether it's hosting a death deck game night or speaking to a community or professional group, she guides individuals and families to engage in meaningful conversations about end of life preferences so that when the time comes, they're prepared and empowered. Her career as a social worker is wide and deep, working early on in community mental health, domestic violence, and trauma before moving to emergency medicine and hospice, where her true passion lies. Accompanying individuals and their families through their final days has taught her innumerable lessons about truly appreciating life. Lisa brings so much wisdom, warmth, and a dash of humor to our conversation today. I can't wait for you to meet her. Oh, my friends, I am so delighted to be saying these words. Welcome, Lisa Pahl, to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast.
Oh, I am so excited to be here today, Lisa. And how fun that we just get to keep saying our own names over and over again.
I know. I was just about to say, for our listeners who are Gen X and older, like us, you may hear me reference once or twice or 10 times today that we are Lisa, and you all are the Cult Jam. And if you're younger than that and don't get the reference, Google it. But yes, welcome to the show. I wanted to start our conversation where I have every conversation now for the past 7 seasons of this show, which is helping us to all unpack the fact that we all hold a set of grief beliefs and that they come from our earliest memories of loss often, and how the adults in our lives responded to that loss, either through implicit or explicit behaviors or language.
Mhm.
And so just inviting you to take us back to a early loss, it might not be a death loss. And what was happening in the environment around that? What do you think you learned about grief from that early experience?
I always love when you ask a guest this question because I think that it uncovers so much about our stories, right? And what has shaped us. You know, the first thing that came up for me when I was thinking about this question was my grandfather, and I want to first start with an experience that I had witnessing him um, in his grief prior to him dying.
Mm,
My grandfather was a Korean War veteran and he came back from war. And we know now that he really suffered with PTSD. And I have these early memories of him being in bed and crying and remember and looking at him and being scared. I didn't understand why tough farmer grandpa was
yeah,
crying in bed. And what's unfortunate is that no one talked to me about why grandpa was crying in bed. And so
yeah.
I didn't know if he was hurt or sick. And this was many years before he died. He died I experienced his death when I was about 20, but my first real loss was my great grandma. She was my absolute favorite person.
Mm,
My family tends to have kids at 18, and so
okay.
my great grandma was a grandma age. My grandma was in her 40s. So my great grandma, I'd love to sit on her lap and look at the hummingbirds, and she had this little arm fat that I loved
The little
to
waddle.
shake. Which I can't believe she let me do because, the kids playing with your little arm flap. But I was actually present when she died. I was
Mm,
in the hospital, and that was also a scary experience. In my little kid brain, she had a seizure and died. I think that what actually happened was she was going through the dying process and no one explained it to me. And so emotions were high. My mom was there, my grandma was there, and I was there and witnessed her death, and and my feelings were I was scared. I didn't understand what had just happened, and unfortunately, you know, it wasn't talked about.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Which is not uncommon, as you know, from the work that you do now, but also just and the listeners will know from the conversations I've had over these last many years. It's really not uncommon that
Mhm.
we don't talk about it or certainly even don't allow kids to be around it. And then if we do, we somehow, historically have thought that like naming anything or bringing anything up will only make it worse as opposed to actually alleviating the fears because our imagination can go places much scarier than what the
Mhm.
reality is when it comes to these things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that and also just naming a little bit about your grandfather and his own grief too, in a way. The losses that war must have brought on, maybe the loss of
Mhm.
sense of belonging or place in the world when he came back. Have
Mhm.
you ever talked with surviving relatives about those losses or what have you now that you do this work, which not to fast forward too much, but thinking about those kind of not that he didn't experience death losses, I'm sure he did fighting combat in a war, but even the non-death losses that your grandfather experienced. Yeah.
Yeah. What's been interesting is my dad, as he's gotten older and continued to get more thoughtful and sensitive,
Yeah.
he started talking probably about 10 years or so ago about being parented by someone that struggled
Yeah.
so much with PTSD and with the grief. It impacted him. My grandfather would never he didn't hunt, he didn't pick up a gun. He had a very strong temper about his my dad didn't hunt very much, but my uncles really did.
Yeah.
And my grandfather was not a fan of that. And my dad, I've heard him say many times that his dad was always saying, if you only saw what guns could do, you wouldn't be
Yeah.
own a gun. And so I think that I wish he had had the words. I wish he had had the words and the support to talk through what happened, because I think it impacted every day
Yeah.
and every relationship with his 7 kids. And then that impacted those kids, who then impacted, it's
Yeah.
generational. And my dad is certainly doing more to talk about those things. So I'm really proud of him.
Yeah, I am too. You've been having some series of conversations that you've recorded, which I'll link those in the show notes for today's episode too. I think they're a really great way to model for all of us who are so lucky enough to have surviving parents
Mhm. Mhm.
of way to gently and kindly, but with thought, kind of approach some of these conversations that we maybe wish we could have had. So I appreciate you and your dad, by the way, for having the courage to be in those conversations. Yeah. And to your
Yeah.
point, you see this, I'm sure, in your work all the time, and we've touched on it in the show over the years, the way that grief carries across generations,
Mhm.
especially unprocessed or unacknowledged grief. I think about, Francis Weller's Five Gates of Grief, then that sixth gate being sort of all the losses that we carry forward, the ancestral loss. And so part of why I ask people to unpack their grief beliefs at the beginning of every episode, I do it with the clients that I work with one on one. When I've taught at university, I even ask my young students to do it too, is part of the gift we give because we're all gonna be ancestors too, right?
Mhm.
So a part
Mhm.
of the gift that we give the people who live in our wake by tending to our own grief is that we don't pass on maybe some of those assumptions that we make that my pain is too much for other people, right?
Mhm.
Or whatever
Mhm.
those kind of cultural assumptions are. Yeah.
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 Yeah, and I think as it relates to kind of some of those grief beliefs, my family, they're Midwesterners. My grandparents were German. There is a very much a pull your stuff self up by the bootstraps mentality and suck it up.
Yeah.
Just suck it up.
Yeah.
There's nothing that you
Nobody
can't
wants to
suck
hear
up.
your whining kind of yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so I think that is the prevalent theme of
Yeah.
everything within I would say the family and culture of the Midwest that I
Yeah.
grew up with. And again, luckily, I think that there is some changes happening with that, where people like you, grief activists, grief educators, people are normalizing
Yes.
these conversations. And watching my mom lose both of her parents, and see that she's become much more comfortable kind of sharing at least some aspects of how she's feeling when she's missing them and that sort of thing. So I think each generation we can get better and better,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
hopefully I'm a pretty open crier and talking
Yeah.
about my grief.
I know you've experienced other profound losses, and I hope today we might even invite Fred into our virtual
Yes.
room, which I'd love to touch on a little bit later on. But I can't help but ask when I have somebody on the show who's bringing, of course, personal loss, but also their professional role with death and dying and grief about what they discovered along their professional path. Because as I've shared before, in my graduate studies as a master social worker, we did not have a single class on loss and grief, which is insane because to work with humans is to work with grief and loss, even if you're not working at a
Mhm,
hospital or something. So I know
mhm,
you've worked in an incredible number of spaces over the past 20-ish something years. You've worked in emergency medicine, you've worked in community mental health, domestic violence spaces, trauma spaces, most recently and for a long time as a hospice social worker. But what do you think when you look back to maybe younger or that early work that you did as a social worker in some of those spaces about what you were paying attention to or not, what your
mhm.
colleagues were paying attention to or not when it comes to conversations around death, end of life, dying, grief, etcetera. What do you notice when you look back on those early years?
Yeah, I really wish I had had more training and support and could have named all the grief I was seeing because grief was everywhere in every setting that I was working. I worked with survivors of torture in Florida, and we had people coming from Bosnia and Sierra Leone, and um, there was certainly a lot of attentive listening and holding space for people, but naming their grief and really thinking about it from a grief perspective of all that was lost. I just didn't have the language or the framework at that time. And then I worked in community mental health with kids and teenagers in East LA, and primarily, mostly those impacted by gangs and violence, and
Yeah.
so and addiction, and there was just grief in every home just flowing out the doors,
Yeah.
and you can feel it in there in the home. And meanwhile, I was, trying to help this kid pay better attention in school, or, like,
Right.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
like,
The case management, the tasks of case management.
how
Yeah.
can this kid possibly,
Yeah.
pay attention in school when his mom and sister and grandfather are all in this gang, and they're, out, and he's worried about them, and then he doesn't see his family. I mean, it was very much, it was like I was trying to put a the tiniest Band-Aid that comes in that Band-Aid box
Yeah.
over a gash that, like, covers your entire stomach. Like, that's
Yeah.
how I felt that work was. And honestly, I left working community mental health after a brother and sister were killed, were murdered. And I just, my own grief at that point, and the amount of countertransference I had, the amount of, like, where I just felt so distraught that this was so many of these young people's future
Yeah.
was something that I wasn't gonna be able to really impact
Change your impact.
in what felt like a meaningful way for me,
Yeah.
and that's actually when I fell into hospice, was when I
Yeah.
left community mental
Yeah.
health.
Well, I wanna dive into hospice so much. I just appreciate you saying this for those of you who aren't in the mental health or helping profession, or those of you who are trained, 10, 20, 30 years ago or more. I hope you can kind of see this. If you're relatively new in the profession and you're thinking, wait, I took a undergraduate and a graduate grief and loss course. I was lucky enough to teach one for several years at University of Texas. I'm so grateful to see that in medicine, in social work, in psychology and counseling, we're moving in that direction.
Mhm,
I
mhm,
think it's important for us to understand that, and this is really, as people have heard, the reason I got into this work over time was even in the helping professions, we've gotten grief so wrong, which not only takes a toll on the people with whom we collaborate or support, what we sometimes call
mhm,
clients, but also for the professionals. I think so
mhm,
much of what we see in our burnout culture and in our turnover and our is, we sort of blame it on, in some ways culturally, on the weakness of the individual employee or worker, but it's really
mhm.
about not having a culture in a workplace that recognizes the physical, emotional, cognitive impact of grief, even when you're bearing witness to somebody else's grief,
Yeah,
right? Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and I think we just, well, that's kind of a whole other topic
Yeah.
as it relates to taking care of the caregivers, right? And
Yeah.
how what we do with the grief that we hear,
Carry.
and what we carry, and what we hold space for. And I think that sometimes I think we still can be operating
Yeah.
from an old model where
Absolutely.
it's just kind of like almost that Midwestern, just keep going.
I was
Just
just about to say there's
keep
that tough,
running.
that suck it up, tough it mentality happens
Yeah.
in workplaces. I worked primarily in nonprofits for most of my career, which means, I was wearing 10 hats and working 60 hours, et cetera. And there was never a bandwidth. And again,
Yeah.
well-meaning people running organizations. So when we talk about the cultural impact on individuals in their grief, the kind of suck it up, the individualism, the tough it up mentality, that the only emotion that's worthy of expressing is happiness and everything else is something you should just, hide in the corner. That shows up even in these helping workplaces. And
Mhm.
part of the work that you're doing with I mean, part of, in my estimation, the work that you're doing previously is part of organizations and now out on your own with the death deck, the end of life deck, and the dementia deck, which we're going to talk about all of these today, is both helping to shift the culture in for providers, giving skills and tools, and for the individuals. It's that same kind of activism in that place around normalizing. And we will, I promise, talk about tending to caregivers, because I think as much as the individual griever or the person going through a terminal diagnosis or a chronic illness is not tended to enough, of course, in my
Mhm.
estimation. I think even more ignored often is the caregivers. And that's going to take a toll not just on the caregiver, of course, but also on the people that they're caring for.
Yeah.
So you mentioned you worked in these spaces where, frankly, though with good intentions, and of course there was a lot of good and meaningful work done, it just kind of came to a too much. So I know we've had some of your peers, hospice nurse Julie McFadden and Penny Smith, and even hospice social work physicians like BJ Miller on the show over the years. What drew you then to hospice social work? And what did you discover over, remind me, how many years were you in that role in hospice social work?
18.
18 years, you all. So I'm sure you saw a lot of changes. I mean, not just depending on the placements where you were working, but just changes in the field. What brought you to it? And what do you notice about the arc of maybe hospice social work as we know it now versus when you got into it 18 years ago? We'll be right back with more of this beautiful conversation. My hope is that this show feels like a safe space to be inside your grief. Remember, you don't need to do this alone. Your grief is valid and a normal response to loss. And the truth is, we live in a grief illiterate culture, which makes navigating this process more challenging than it needs to be. As a narrative therapy trained social worker and student of grief education and ritual, I'm here to walk alongside you. I'll offer you a place to feel seen and held and help you discover skills and practices for being with both grief and joy. Let me be your guide. If you're interested in learning more about individual grief support with me, you can visit lisakeefauver.com after the show today.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, I had quit community mental health and but what I really loved about that work was the intimacy of being in people's homes. And when I worked with survivors of torture in Florida, that was also home based. And
Yeah,
so I felt really comfortable being in people's homes. And I love the ability to look on people's walls and see like the pictures, see people
yeah,
at different ages, their family, have the random neighbor show up and realize, okay, this guy's He's he's part of everything here, right?
yeah,
And when people just show up in an office, you just get whoever they present as that day,
yeah,
right? When you go into people's homes, you really see it all. And for better or worse, or all the messiness of
yeah.
life. And
But more
and
information either way, which
yeah,
is useful.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and I feel like it resonated with me, and so I started kind of looking at what I could do that was home based, and kind of stumbled, like I said, onto hospice.
yeah,
But within the first week, I knew I felt so comfortable around death and
mhm,
dying. I was raised on a farm, and I do feel that farming is life and death. We had years where we slaughtered our own animals. I was involved in that. And there was a there was a very kind of basic, yeah, people
yeah,
die, animals
yeah,
die, everything dies. Like, don't make a fuss, but it's gonna happen, that kind of facts of life.
yes,
Um,
yeah,
and so I felt I felt comfortable in that space and was very the other thing I really love about hospice is being able to support people at such a difficult time, but they know that we're not going to fix it. And when someone is on hospice, we know they have a terminal diagnosis. We know they have a prognosis of 6 months or less. They may be family members and the person may be hoping for a miracle, but they aren't necessarily thinking that we're going to provide that miracle, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
my other work that I had done was more about like, you know, let's get this kid to be doing his homework. Let's get this teenager to not be
Solution-focused kind of
drinking.
work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's
Yeah.
like have these very specific goals that are really, about improving somebody or changing
Yeah.
someone's behavior. And this, we're just accompanying people. And we're
Yeah.
just educating and supporting and listening. And I think that that's where really beautiful work can take place when
Yeah.
we just are focused on those basics. And I've loved the work. Yeah.
Yeah. Something you just said there, I just wanted to draw out for, again, for our listeners, whether you have a family member who's maybe in or heading towards hospice or you work in the space. There's nothing wrong with, of course, helping people with their goals or case manager. I mean, I was a case manager for years. I hope this conversation isn't seen as diminishing that. But one of
Mhm,
the things I think is so beautiful about what you just said and the work of hospice social workers, hospice nurses, and others is that unfortunately, it takes until when we know there is no quote unquote cure, that we
mhm,
are heading towards our death. Or you might be able to get to have the actually meaningful conversation like, what are your goals?
mhm.
Person that I'm
Well,
supporting,
right.
patient, however you call them, or client. What are your goals? What does a good life mean? What would a good day look like?
Mhm,
Getting really centering the expertise and the choice and the agency and the interest of the patient in ways that, and again, for sometimes understandable reasons, in other helping situations and settings, we don't really get at. So,
mhm,
like goals of care when you're trying to rehab somebody to walk again is very important. We want to help somebody walk again, but goals of care in a hospice setting is intimate, right?
mhm. It's very intimate, and the hospice model is that it is patient and family driven, and so
Yeah.
it's not just, and we do use patient. It is
Yes.
considered
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
it's a medical setting, so we use patient, but it's the patient and family, that is the focus and who's driving it. It's not the physician, it's not myself,
Yeah.
it is what is most important for this patient and family, how what is their particular pain tolerance and how much medication they want to be used. What are they willing to tolerate with that? What are their hopes and what are their often people will be trying to make it to a grandchild's graduation or a wedding or
Yeah.
something specific that we say, okay, well, if that's your goal, let's give you some steroids. Let's like
Yeah.
try to keep you eating as long as possible. Let's like, if this is your goal, other people are ready to go. I have patients in their 90s or 100 and you know, they've said,
Yeah.
"I'm just praying every night that God takes me home," and that's their goal is to
Yeah.
do as little as possible intervention-wise because they really want to be they're ready. They're ready to
Yeah.
get to pass, and so I think that is, like, one of my favorite parts of this
Yeah.
work, and I do wanna speak to the point of I've loved working in the other populations I worked
Yeah.
with. I feel like for me, this has just fit my personality better.
Yes.
Um and
Yeah.
my skill set, and so but what I love about the career of social work is that you can bounce around and do so many
Yeah.
different things with so many different populations, and this work, I feel like we do tend to get burnt out or
Yeah.
have some compassion fatigue, and so when that time comes, it's time to pivot. It's time
Yeah.
to do something new. Yeah.
Shout out, by the way, for the social work profession. You're
Yeah.
listening to 2 social workers having conversation, and yeah, I mean, I didn't know when I started my career in foster care and adoption as a home visiting case manager that I would also be an author and a keynote speaker and a podcaster, but also be able to work with grievers, and I've founded nonprofits and been a clinical director, I've worked in lots of settings. So if you're thinking about going into the helping profession, we're not being endorsed or paid for by NASW, but consider the social work profession. I want to make sure that we're touching base to some of the intersections of personal and professional because of course this happens all the time. Same for me, we're working in with different populations, we're working around death and dying and grief and then of course our lives are also intersecting on that personally. But before we sort of move from, your experience over these 18 years in hospice social work. I've asked, again, every one of my previous guests who've worked in these settings or populations, what you think you are the most one or two, whatever you want to share, harmful myths or misunderstandings people have
Mm,
about hospice social work or just hospice in general, maybe about MAID, medical aid in dying,
mhm.
about who qualifies, what the experience is. Is there one that you feel like if you could wave a magic wand and everybody, you know, got it right this time or understood with a little more nuance? Is there something that comes up for you when I ask that?
Oh, I have a whole presentation on hospice myths, so that's
I know.
a hard one.
Hire Lisa to come talk to your org. But in the meantime, is there one or two that feel really
Yes.
resonant right now?
I think that the an important one is that hospice is not there 24/7. And unfortunately, sometimes patients need, someone to be helping them 24/7, but that isn't the role of hospice. Hospice
Yeah.
has professionals who come in and out of the home,
Yeah.
and it's our job to support with symptom management, help educate and support along the way with the family. But it means that a nurse is going to come typically a couple times a week, sometimes more. The social worker is going to come once a week, sometimes once a month if there's not a big need or depending
Yeah.
on different variables. And so I think people think that
Mm,
they're surprised sometimes that they would have to then hire a caregiver or have to take time off work to be present. And they think that maybe hospice is just going to take care of it.
yeah.
And that's not,
That could be a real shock for families, obviously, who are,
it is
um
a shock. And insurance doesn't cover for those caregivers either. And that's a big shock because people think
yeah,
that their Medicare or their supplemental plan covers caregiving, but there isn't unless you have a
yeah,
specific long-term care policy. So
yeah,
that's the other heartbreak that people run into is realizing that piece.
the
So,
financial piece. Well, we
yeah.
could definitely have an entire episode railing against our current healthcare system and what it does and doesn't cover, but I
The
fear
grief of all of that, yes.
we will never come back to these conversations. But just because I have the chance to know you and call you my friend, there's a couple of stories I'd love for you to share with our audience about. Again, it's all well and good to be a professional in this space and to know some things. I say this all the time about my own journey. You know, I was a clinical social worker when my husband died. And so I think it, on the one hand, gives us some knowledge maybe that other people might not have. And on the other hand, it doesn't always save us from ourselves. And I know you've shared across time and space a story about caregiving for your mother in law and some wishes and hopes you had for how she would spend her final days. And can you share that story with us?
Yeah, yeah. So my mother-in-law, Kay,
Mm.
she called me her daughter in love, and which it was so sweet. And she even introduced me to her friends. This is Lisa, my daughter in love, and so I was honored to be able to help take care of her. She was living in Michigan, where my family also is. And so my husband and I took turns flying back and forth from California to Michigan to be taking care of her for the 3 months that she lived from diagnosis to death with pancreatic cancer. And yeah, this was 5 years ago. And I had not only been in hospice a long time, but had created these card games and had been talking to all these people about end of life and end of life planning. And so I have my own ideas about what I wanted her to accomplish before she died. I had known from working with some of my patients that were able to participate in some of these legacy projects, just how impactful that could be for the family. And so I just got in my head that she had to make some videos
Yeah.
for my son, who was 5 at the time, or sorry, no, who was 10 at the time,
Yeah.
and then my husband and his sister. And I thought, "Oh, man, if I"
Yeah.
so I'm just gonna pause and let that sink in. "If I could then give them these videos that we could record together after she was gone, think of how good that would feel for them, right?
Yeah.
And I kind of paused on the word "I" because there was a lot of ego involved in this, and I couldn't see it at the time. All I kept thinking was, I have so much information, and
Yeah.
I know what might feel good for people, and so I just have to convince her to do it.
Yeah.
And, she initially was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, okay, honey." And then I'd bring it up, and then she'd, "Oh, it's a pretty busy day." And, anyway, she kept putting it off, and, fortunately, I talked to my brother-in-law about it one day, and he was really blunt with me, and he said, "This is what you want. She never said she really wanted to do that, and so she's showing you how she wants to spend her final time, and
Yeah.
I think you need to back off." Now, he said that in a Midwestern way, so I'm sure it was a lot nicer than how I just said it, but it was
We are definitely
basically
nice. We're definitely known for our niceness. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it was basically like, "This isn't about you." And
How did you take that at the time looking back? Were you able to be like, "Ouch, but yeah, you have a point," or
I was, because it hurt. It did
Yeah.
hurt. Initially, of course, had a defensive feeling of like, but I'm just
If
trying
you
to
just
help,
listen to
you
me?
know? But he was completely right, and once I let go of that,
Yeah.
her and I could really just focus on spending time together, and I look back at that time, and we had one day where she said, "Let's go get all my favorite Chinese food and go to the beach." And so I drove to 3 different Chinese restaurants, which she went into each one because she knew the owners, because this is
Yeah.
a somewhat smaller town. So we went to 3 Chinese places for her to go in, get her favorite, egg rolls from one place and chow mein
Yeah.
from another place and something
Yeah.
else from a third place. And she talked to each of the owners, told them that she was very sick with cancer and didn't think she'd see him again, and said goodbye. And then we went to the beach and we had a feast of Chinese food, and it was lovely. And once I could like once I could get out of our way
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
just appreciate the moments for what they were and be as present as possible, that became one of my most precious times in my life so far. Mhm.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing Kay with us and for sharing that story with us. And I want to amplify a few things that you said there. One was this isn't an admonition to try to have the conversations. In fact, the end of life deck, the death deck, which we're going to touch on, and the your latest incredible creation, the dementia deck, is very much about having conversations, right? About these things that we're all going to face. And yeah, sometimes when we are so focused on task or productivity or outcome or an idea, we miss the subtlety. We miss seeing what our person is showing us, even if they're not telling
Mhm.
us they want from us. And no criticism to all of us who do that because we all do that because it also feels a little less vulnerable and intimate to like have a task to do
Mhm.
versus just being with somebody, because that
Mhm.
also requires you to be with your own anticipatory grief and to be there. So I just name all of this both to you, even as a skilled professional, but to all of us listening, because many of us, I've been there twice with my husband and then my friend Joe, where I had to kind of sit alongside. We don't have a lot of practice or skill at that. So
Yeah.
yeah, just to offer to all of us those conversations can be helpful, and I wanna talk about the tools that you're offering us. And just as I tried to practice as somebody who offers grief support one-on-one or even as a friend in other people's lives, hopefully you would, uh, agree with this since you're a friend of mine too. The gift that we can give people is to come alongside them
Yeah.
and to match their pace and to
Mhm.
reflect back to them and mirror them and maybe only ask the questions that help them drop deeper into the things that matter most to them or the things they wish they could have said and haven't yet. And
Yeah.
that's more of a gift than a product that we might create out of something for people. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's hard to do. I think
It's
it can
so
be
hard.
really hard to do. One of the things that comes up for me is when someone has a new diagnosis, or I hear from a friend about their family member, and how sick they are when they're in the hospital. And I know from my years of experience, like, how this is going to go. They aren't ready to know that.
Yeah.
And so, it does become a delicate dance that we do to let people go at their pace, to look for openings that they might be willing to hear just a slight opening of the creak of a door to say, "Oh,
Yeah.
tell me more about that. Have you been thinking about what might happen next?" Or, being able to just kind of be curious, but to stay where they're at. And hospice has really taught me that. We have people who come onto hospice and they or their family isn't ready to know, exactly about prognosis or what we were thinking in
Yeah.
terms of their timeline or even what's ahead. Sometimes people it's too much. And so we just have to take what's in front of us and be present with that and accompany it and then just slightly plan
Yeah.
ahead. Just plant
Yeah.
those seeds.
Well, that's where I think about hospice social work, maybe even hospice nursing, and the work I'd like to think that I do as well is it's really an art in a way.
Mhm,
It's an
mhm,
art of being human. It's the art of life. And because
mhm,
you can learn all the skills and the practices, but each human in front of you, each family configuration, each diagnosis takes you being really present in your own self to like notice when the doors are opening and when there's a willingness to be
mhm,
curious out loud with somebody. And that just takes time and experience, I think, and a kind of
mhm.
willingness to not be expert, which is really hard for all of us in every domain of our life to not come in with total expertise at the expense of really understanding the wisdom of the person with whom we're showing up to support.
Yeah, and I think that even comes into play with grievers, right? We
Absolutely.
we may do a better job at really listening and not giving people space, and we can relate to people as fellow grievers. But it can be hard sometimes because we might have our own ideas of what helped us, or, this is how it went for me, or we might be eager to kind of, help. We're
Yeah.
just trying to help,
Yeah.
Um, and in doing that can really both minimize as well as make people think that they're doing it wrong somehow
Yes.
because our
Yeah.
our grief responses aren't matching up.
Yeah. Which then just shuts people down.
Yeah,
Nobody likes to be able to feel perceived as if they're doing it wrong. It's
yeah.
funny that you bring that up when I just taught a course a little bit on sticky grief stories, and I'm about to probably by the time this comes out, my Substack will be out. But, in graduate school, the reason I was fumbling on calling patient is we couldn't call our clients in our process recordings or in our work or in our case notes because the approach of sort of narrative therapy is really that we are collaborators or consultants with so we would call them the people with whom we consult, which, really rolls off the tongue when you say it or write it in a case note, like, "Thank you, more words." But I think that's the perspective that I take in my work, and I don't know if you would have used that language, but it seems to me, knowing you and the approach you take to your work, that that's been your approach too, is, like, really understanding that, yes, you have some information, that there's some education that you can offer, but at the end of the day, we're really looking to lean on the experience and the insights and the passion and the wisdom of the people that we're supporting. And that's where I think more magical relationships and also just the experience as much as it can be a little more magical with that approach.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and just to kind of clarify, I don't refer to patients as patients only when
Okay,
I'm
no.
talking about them in the
Yes, of course.
abstract. We go by their names
Yes,
and
of course, of course.
their
Yeah.
family members' names and that sort of thing. Yeah,
I just brought that up for the, like, sort of I think there has to be expertise and training because I think
Mhm.
I am actually currently witnessing this out in the world that I think there is some maybe not enough sort of wisdom or care that's taken to thinking about showing up for people in these really vulnerable spaces, and yet
Mhm.
when we're showing up for the people we're supporting, whether it's our family member, whether it's our patient, whether it's our client, whether it's the people with whom we consult, whatever the category is, there has to be a sort of check on power and authority and expertise so that
Mhm.
we don't miss what it is they actually want in this moment, what it is
Yeah.
they can bring to their own illness or their own grief.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, speaking of like, how do we connect with people? How do we help them understand what do I even want if I'm facing the end of my life? What my own life, or if a loved one is experiencing that years ago. And I'd love to hear the story a little bit. I know you co-created, believe it or not, party games. Get ready for it if you're watching us on YouTube, right? You're the co-creator of the Death Deck, which is an incredible, yeah, I'd call it card game, starting conversations, surprising conversations about death, and then also the end of life deck, again,
Mhm.
following up on that. And most recently, the dementia deck, which I want to make sure we have time to talk about before we close today. But I'm going to look through and find some of my favorite questions. But what do you think it's important for people to know about something like the death deck or the end of life deck in terms of maybe the listener who's I'm too scared to talk about it because I feel like if I bring it up to my family, they're gonna shut down, or we just don't talk about those things in our family. What does a tool like this help, and why are these conversations important even in the first place? We'll be right back with more of this beautiful conversation. More than ever, my friends, I'm passionate about creating meaningful community and offering you more insight into my work and even into my life, too. I want a place to explore topics in depth, expand my creative expressions through things like long form essays and even maybe some audio and video guided practices. I want to be able to share some behind the scenes moments from the podcast and maybe even eventually host a Dear Lisa column. Most importantly, I want to build an authentic, interactive community off social media. Life is happening so fast, and I want a place where we can slow down, dive deeper, and figure out how to metabolize it all together. And I'd love to have you join me. That's why I launched my Substack, AFCO with Lisa Keefauver. Now, if you haven't heard me talk about it in my book or from the stage, or maybe even here on the podcast, AFCO stands for Another Fucking Growth Opportunity. Yes, of course, I had to get in a judicious use of cussing. Rest assured, my friends, like in all my work, I'll show up authentically, offer thoughtful, meaningful, and practical guidance on how to center aliveness in a world full of loss. I really look forward to your comments, our chats, creating special audio and video content for you, and more. And if you'd like things delivered to your inbox, don't worry, AFCO with Lisa Keefauver will come directly to you. You can sign up after today's episode at afco with lisakefauver.substack.com. You can find it in the show notes, or if that's all too much, just head to my website, lisakefauver.com.
Yeah, so the Death Deck we created in 2018, and I created that with Lori Cicero. It was the spouse of a hospice patient of mine, her husband Joe, and yeah, we came together and decided that we wanted to create a tool to help people have conversations about death and dying before a medical crisis, before terminal diagnosis, when it's easier to have these conversations,
Yeah.
because in the heat of the moment, it is very, very difficult, especially if someone, as in Joe's case, once he received a pancreatic cancer diagnosis, he was all about fight, fight, fight. He used a lot of
Yeah.
battle language, and Lori got on board with that. She was aligned with him. And so they didn't have these conversations. And
Yeah.
so, like many people, then his end of life, she had a lot of questions about what he would have wanted when he was
Mm,
dying. And so we combined to try to help people have these conversations. And we use a lot of humor and
yeah.
multiple choice questions to lighten it up and give people opportunities to also come at it from a lot of different directions. You know, we have playful questions, we have more serious questions, and the idea being like, we'll get
Start
you to
where
talk
you
what
can.
yeah, we'll get you to talk one way or another, you know?
Yeah.
And if it's about whether mediums can communicate with the dead and that leads into some storytelling, or about spirits that visit you, that's an entry point, right? And the reasons for having these conversations are, you know, as I described with Lori, she was left making a lot of guesses about what
Yeah.
Joe would want. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of second guessing in grief, so much guessing and
So
grief.
much regret, remorse, sometimes shame, second guessing. Yeah.
Yeah, and when we don't know what our person would have wanted in these situations and we are left caring for them and making decisions for them, it can cause distress. It can also cause conflict between family members, and we see that unfortunately a lot because each of us has our own relationship with the person, and we also have our own ideas, like I did with my
Right.
mother-in-law, Kay. Like, we have our own ideas about how things should go, but that doesn't mean that they are our
The
person's
yeah.
ideas, right?
Well, appreciate that. I so appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so when we can have these conversations, I mean, I could talk about this forever and
Yeah.
ever, Lisa, but I think one of the huge reasons too is just we have to get more comfortable with death and
Yeah.
dying and in turn with grief. And when we're fearful, when we avoid the topic, it just gets bigger. It gets
Yeah.
scarier. And so bringing these conversations out into the open, having some laughs about them and realizing that, you know what, it isn't that death is funny, but there's humor that we can find in all situations. It doesn't have to be scary to talk about the
Yeah.
topic.
Also, to your point, it can elicit some storytelling that you might like. I've played it a little bit, and actually, I'm bringing all three decks home to Michigan. Hello, fellow Michigander here over Thanksgiving to have this with my elderly parents, but also my brother, who's just a few years older than me, because I also think it elicits stories in a way
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
sometimes just a straightforward, like, tell me about your childhood, grandpa, may not come out. But if you ask a particular question, um, around your burial or how you feel about doctors and the medical system, or then you might elicit a kind of story that you never would have heard otherwise, which is such a treasure.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it really is. I've played the death deck with, I mean, countless people at this point,
Yes.
but I've played with friends, and I mean, we learned so every time we've played, we learned so much about each other that we would have
Yeah.
never discovered and and the other bonus is that because we're having these real conversations, it's moments of connection.
Yeah.
And, you know, in this moment in time, any
Boy,
way
do we
that we
need more of those.
find to connect with strangers, with people we love, with anyone and everyone,
Yeah.
I think it serves us all.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I agree with you in terms of, the earlier the better. And having worked with hundreds of grievers and been a griever multiple times myself, I think there's so much room for unnecessary suffering, both for the
Mhm.
person who's dying, but also, of course, for the people they leave behind for those unanswered questions. And it's not that there might be some specific thing, there still might be things you haven't gotten at to, but to thinking about the kinds of things like one of the questions you have in the death deck is when I can no longer tell you what I want to hear, please play A, my all-time favorite music playlist, B, audiobooks or inspirational words, C, the sounds of the ocean or a river, even with a bedpan nearby, which I love the humor in that. But here we are letting ourselves know a little bit more, feel more empowered to honor that person, especially at the point in which maybe they can't communicate that anymore, which gets us to the topic I want to make sure we cover before we end our time here together today, which is your most recent launch is the dementia deck that you created in collaboration. Tell us a little bit about who you created in collaboration with, and I've got a couple of cards I wanna make sure we read, but tell me a little bit about why this specific deck was important and what you're hearing from all the folks who are using it across the country already right now.
Yeah, I'm really proud of the Dementia deck. It's a collaboration with Compassion and Choices. Compassion and Choices is a national end of life education and advocacy group. They do a lot of advocacy for end of life options. They also do extensive work within the field of dementia and advanced care planning. And so the rationale for the dementia deck is that, you know, our end of life planning should include
Yeah.
conversations about dementia. And We know that people typically live with dementia for many years, typically, right? Sometimes even up to 15 years. And so when we think about that long of a time period and we think about um, the toll that that takes on the person and on their family, ignoring it doesn't make it go away.
No.
And, one of the death debt questions asks, which illness do you fear the most?
Yeah.
And number one by
Yeah.
far is dementia. People are very
Yeah.
fearful of receiving this diagnosis and living with dementia. And so we want to help people have conversations, but we also want to help also destigmatize and
Yeah.
demystify and help decrease some of our fears and anxiety around dementia by talking it through, right? And there are so many opportunities that arise in terms of decisions that can be made by family members. And unfortunately, most of the time, it isn't talked about. And so then the family is left with, well, of course, we're just going to keep doing everything exactly as we normally would because I don't know whether they would want this or not. And so some of those big questions are how people feel about feeding tubes when they can no longer
Yeah.
swallow. But there's a lot of smaller decisions too, like, if if I was living with dementia and then diagnosed with cancer, would I want to do any chemo or cancer
Mm,
treatment? How
yeah.
do I feel about the fate of a cancer death versus a dementia living that time out? And these are very personal discussions. These are really hard to think about. I acknowledge that and have gone through the questions myself. Um, and we may not know exactly because
Yeah.
our answer today might be different tomorrow. But what we know from talking to family caregivers and my experience talking to caregivers is that when they've had conversations and they can remember those conversations, it helps people guide their decisions and it gives
Yeah.
them more confidence that they can make
Yeah.
decisions for their person because we talked about it. As an example, I have played the dementia deck with my parents, but also completed Compassion and Choices Dementia Directive tool,
Yeah.
which is this wonderful dementia values and priorities tool that you basically can say, at this point, when this happens, I want
Yeah.
comfort measures only, or I want
The
aggressive.
whole thing. Yeah.
And so when I talked about it with my parents, we basically exchanged, we looked at each other's answers and they were completely aligned. And so my parents now, and that isn't the same for all family, but it
Yeah.
just happened to be in our family. And now my parents have a lot more confidence that I'm going to know instinctively how to take care of them in the
Mm.
way they wanted because my answers were their answers. And so now, of course, we can get into the psychology of that. Like my beliefs and my ideas are shaped by my parents. And
Of course. Yeah.
but you know,
Or even if what you discover is there's some opposition there, then let's have that conversation now. Where is a middle ground, or what are the decisions we make, or what other information do each of us need to help us come to a more aligned decision? Again, in part,
yeah,
well, to make more ease for the person living with dementia, but also, as we were talking about earlier, so much second guessing and remorse and guilt and shame happens for the caregivers even before maybe a death if they're not certain, did this align or did this not align? Yeah.
yeah, I'm really glad you brought that part up because I think it can be very hard when you're someone you care about is wants different decisions made
Yeah.
or has a different idea. Perhaps it could be that your value is that life is worth living at any cost. And
Right.
mine is comfort measures immediately upon diagnosis. That is a pretty wide gap in terms of what our beliefs are. And what that tells us is there's lots of room for conversation. It also tells us that maybe I'm not the best healthcare decision maker for you. If
Yes. Good
we
point.
are so disaligned that it's going to cause me anguish keeping you alive as long as you want to be, then perhaps there's another family member or someone else that
Yeah.
would be a better fit.
That's so important. And I think, what you bring up there in these conversations, whether it's our conversations around end of life or just death in general or dementia in particular, is I think so many of us feel like, well, if I just don't talk about it, then, it'll be fine and we'll just figure it out. But I think this notion of having the courage, also bringing forth connection, as you said, in conversation, to name the gap between is also just information. I think some people might think like, well, I don't want to ask a question and know that we're differently aligned because then what? And I guess my answer was, then what? That's information. So then that's information to
Mhm,
say, is there a third party that could help a hospice social worker, for instance, who could help
mhm,
us understand better? Because maybe each of us are coming with some preconceived ideas. Could they maybe we
mhm,
could get some education, maybe we could get some
mhm,
supportive counseling. To your point,
mhm,
maybe then I'm not the best medical power of attorney to make decisions for your what's going to happen with your care. I think more information there and more conversation and more intimacy is better than not. I know it's hard, listener, if you're embarking on this right now or you've been there
yeah,
before or you're even just imagining the day that it's going to come. I just want to name how much deep
mhm,
compassion I have for it. And it's not, simple, and yet it's important. And I think the
mhm.
benefits are even more profound than what we've named today.
Yeah, I think that's an important, you know, thing to acknowledge. It's easy in this moment to be talking about, preparing for end of life and how valuable that is. But on the other hand, as you know, my friend died in the summer,
Yeah.
and there's certainly times when the last thing I want to do is think and talk about death. And I think, there's a death positive movement that, some people have a really difficult time with the language. And I don't actually like to use that phrase as well, because I do think that it implies as though we celebrate, death,
Yes.
or that it's a good thing. But people in the space, that's not really what it's about. What it's about is acknowledging that death happens to us all,
Yeah.
and that our way of dealing with death by avoidance and putting off
Yeah.
and not
It's just
talking
causing more
about.
harm, not less harm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's causing more harm, and so how can we normalize that
Yeah.
grief is everywhere, death and
Yeah.
dying is
Yeah.
everywhere, without becoming Debbie Downers.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. Love a good Saturday Night Live skit reference there.
Uh-huh.
Well, and you know this, we've talked about it, and I know our listeners maybe feel this way and certainly have heard this from guests across the seasons is I really do believe not just in theory, but in practice in my lived life. And I think you do too, Lisa, that first of all, we can't always be focusing on death, dying, and grief. That's even though those of us do it for a living. And yet the the gift, I would say, in a way of tuning in towards the reality that, this is our one wild and precious life, as Mary Oliver reminds us, is the opposite. Where am I
Mhm,
spending my energy? What are the
mhm.
conversations I want to have? What are the experiences that matter to me? What is the small stuff that I'm sweating that I don't want to sweat anymore?
Yeah.
What are my priorities? And that's where I think I think it's more about not being death. I don't know about death positive or grief positive. I call myself a grief activist. It's about I think this is a phrase I heard from Francis Weller once, but it's about right sizing our relationship with
Mhm, mhm,
grief,
mhm,
right sizing our relationship with death and dying.
mhm.
Because right now it's so disproportionately suppressed or pushed back or out there, which actually leads to more fear. And I think conversations that can happen as a result of these cards in the work that you do in our own personal lives in lots of different ways. This podcast, I hope, is a part of that, helps us right size our relationship with these things that 100% of us will experience.
Yeah, yeah, and I like what you said about helping to prioritize our lives. When we think about the fact that our time on earth is finite, then we get to choose, right? We get to choose how we are spending this life. We get to choose what relationships we want to prioritize and what we might want to let go, or we prioritize. um I mean, for me, relationships are the number one most important thing,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
certainly, our careers and what we're doing, and is this how I want to be remembered? Is this my legacy? Like, all of these big questions that are juicy and,
Yeah.
wonderful and vast are related to the fact that we have to acknowledge that we're going to die, and that this is this is whether we name it or not, this is how we are living our lives, right? And does that feel complete? Does that feel right? And and so I think, yeah, there's just so many opportunities when we release a little fear and spend more time in
Yeah.
reflection.
Yeah. I love that so much, Lisa. In a way, what came to mind was when we right size our relationship with the fact that, yeah, there's going to be an end for all of us. It's actually such a beautiful invitation to be present to joy or
Mhm.
delight or sweetness or the random acts of kindness or all the
Mhm.
things that also not just quote unquote make life worth living, but also help us carry the weight of our sorrow too. It's the both and really. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
The yeah, you said it so well.
No. Well, thank you. Lisa, Pahl, thank you so much for joining me on Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast today. This was such a wonderful, rich conversation. Listeners, you're going to hear more in the close of the show about where you can find information on the death deck, the end of life deck, the dementia deck, and all the resources that Lisa has to offer. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, I just loved our conversation as I always love our conversation. So thank you for having me.
Bye, everyone. Oh, my grieving friends, thank you for being the cult jam to our Lisa in the cult jam today. I'm sure you agree. Lisa's kind voice, depth of knowledge, and deep care are exactly what we need to find the courage and strength to have those important but often unpracticed conversations with our loved ones. Now, check the show notes for today's episode to learn more about Lisa and the Death Deck, End of Life Deck, and her latest conversation starter pack, the Dementia Deck. Lisa is so kind and she's offering our listeners a special discount code. So visit thedeathdeck.com and enter GSB20 at checkout to get 20% off your order. That's GSB20 when you visit thedeathdeck.com. Now, if you loved this episode, we'd so appreciate it if you took just a few moments to head to the Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast show page on Apple Podcasts, leave a 5-star rating, and write a review about what the show meant to you. Until next time, my friends, I see you, I hear you, and I'm holding you in my heart.